pleased to support Coffee with the Cloud. I thought I would take a moment and share with you the history of the credit union. In 1937, the credit union was formed by faculty and staff on campus. Those individuals came together to create the credit union because they were not able to be banked after the Depression. And for the first 20 years of our organization, that volunteer board of directors managed the credit union. And if someone needed a $100 loan, they would call 10 members and ask them for $10 in deposit. With that, in 1957, we grew large enough to hire our very first employee, and she managed the credit union for over 30 years. Today, I'm proud to say that we are the 46th largest credit union in the United States with $4.2 billion in assets, 865 employees, and 265,000 members worldwide, many Spartan alums, faculty, staff, and students.
Jointly appointed in the Political Theory and Constitutional Democracy major of James Madison College and in the Department of Philosophy. He is an interdisciplinary scholar whose teaching and research draws upon philosophy, political theory, Black studies, and indigenous studies in order to understand the histories of colonialism and chattel slavery and how they continue to shape contemporary political and social context and thought. His current book manuscript, Marinage, Confederacy and Revolution, examines Black and indigenous anti-colonial thought during the 18th century. He has been named a 2019-2020 Woodrow Wilson Career Enhancement Fellow. Please welcome Dr. Peters.
So thank you for the introduction and the invitation to share my work with you all. Michigan State University occupies the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the Anishinaabe, the Three Fires Confederacy of Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi peoples. As the title suggests, I will be talking about Black radical political thought in the 18th century. To be clear, this work is inextricable from histories of indigenous dispossession and struggle for sovereignty. In James Madison College, as well as in the Department of Philosophy, I teach texts that are part of the Black radical tradition, which criticizes and analyzes slavery, colonialism, liberalism, capitalism, racial hierarchy, and gendered violence. The Black radical tradition has often been in conversation with the European radical tradition, think Marx and Rousseau and others, which is concerned with a variety of anti-capitalist, communitarian, and revolutionary reorderings of the world. However, this second tradition has historically not attended to racism and colonialism as foundational aspects of the colonial world. The Black radical tradition is concerned with liberation, freedom, equality for people of African descent, and analyzing the European political ideals of liberation and freedom for all, including those who are racialized, colonized, subordinated through gender, and those exploited by capitalism. This is the radicalism of the tradition. These groups are not mutually exclusive, and it is key to understand that these unfreedoms are systematic as well as interconnected. First, some thoughts on terminology. In her Nobel Prize lecture, Toni Morrison utilized a story to think through responsibility that all language users have to not use language for violence, duplicity, and the stifling of human flourishing. So if we're thinking about the Black radical tradition, I would like to begin by thinking about the use of the word tradition within this context. And I'm somebody who wrote his whole dissertation on the British Member of Parliament and father of modern day conservatism, Edmund Burke, right? Expert on tradition. All right. So I recognize that even the idea of tradition can function to ossify and prevent thinking. Myself, I'm partial to understanding the texts and practices that are focused on freedom, liberation, and decolonization as embodiments of living thought. This is why Ruth Gilmore often calls a Black radical tradition Black living thought, where the living refers not only to the people who are creating it, but also to the idea that it is an action and that it is something that is unbounded. In many ways, my introduction to the Black radical tradition comes through Ruthie Gilmore's essay, Abolition Geography and the Problem of Innocence, where she talks about prison abolition and the need to abolish the prison industrial complex. However, scholars such as Anthony Bogues and Cedric Robinson are also very prominent in my thinking. This thought begins roughly in the 16th century throughout the Americas when Africans are brought to the New World as human chattel or sellable property. The Black and Black radical tradition refers to those who are seen as other to Europeans in a process of racialization. So the Black is the Black that we understand today. Blackness in this context refers to those people who self-identify with people of African descent, who occupied, if not the lowest rung, one of the lowest rung in political and social life in a racialized world. Known contributors to the Black radical tradition include figures such as Cecile Fatima, Toussaint Louverture, Jacques Dessalines, who are all people who contribute to the Haitian Revolution, Frederick Douglass and Harriet Jacobs, the great abolitionist, Ida B. Wells, the great anti-lynching advocate, W.E.B. Du Bois, Amy Cesar, C.L.R. James, Claudia Jones. Many of you probably know of Audre Lorde, Toni Cade Bambara, and many, many more. So the end of the 18th century sees the emergence of revolutionary ideas about human and natural rights. Think we hold these truths to be self-evident. This is the end of the 18th century. And the end of the 18th century was also a space of profound economic, political, and social instability created by the 7 Years' War. And we think of this in terms of the French and Indian War. This instability created three cataclysmic revolutions: the American Revolution, the French Revolution, and the Haitian Revolution. But this also led to the emergence of new thought, anti-slavery thought, and various forms of European, Black, and indigenous anti-colonial thought. So you think about the emergence of rights, you think about these profound revolutions, and then you think about the emergence of anti-slavery thought, people who are against chattel slavery, and anti-colonial thought, people who are against colonialism. Examining the 18th century requires an understanding of the centuries that come before it, and it requires a particular understanding of the racial plantation system that emerged from the Spanish encomienda system. Right? So I am one for history lessons, lots and lots of history lessons. So the racial plantation system, the thing that we know as slavery, emerges from the Spanish encomienda system implanted by the Spanish government throughout the Americas in the 16th and 17th century. This system placed indigenous people's labor in the hands of a few landowners, and it meant that indigenous people were forced into agricultural, mining, domestic labor, and so much more. And the system of labor would be transformed into what we know as plantation slavery, which relied on the cultivation of monocrops such as sugar, indigo, coffee, tobacco, rice, and cotton for exportation. And what we know is that each crop required extensive labor for cultivation, and that plantation life and work were marked by extreme violence in order to produce the greatest amount of productivity and control over human beings. In the colonies, whether French, British, Dutch, Portuguese, or Spanish, political and social power became concentrated in the hands of wealthy planters. In these slave-owning societies, ownership of human beings became the basis for political power. It should not surprise us that 3 of our first 4 presidents were slave owners, right? In the Caribbean, where the productions of sugar, coffee, and tobacco created great wealth for individuals and nations, African labor would soon replace indigenous labor. In contrast to white indentured servants and enslaved indigenous people, Africans were considered a cheap and renewable source of labor. Thus, by the 17th century, the plantation was thoroughly racialized, and blackness became synonymous with slavery, or slavery became synonymous with blackness. You can cut it both ways. But it's important to recognize the historical contingency of something that appears inevitable. The connection between blackness and slavery was not preordained or natural, but was the result of fitting different populations into the plantation system in order to exploit their labor. So this is about labor forces and not about the skin color of particular people. One of the most prominent historians of the Caribbean, Eric Williams, wrote, "Slavery in the Caribbean has been too narrowly identified with the Negro. A racial twist has thereby given to what is basically an economic phenomenon. Slavery was not born of racism. Rather, racism was the consequence of slavery." So as those who study the plantation in the Caribbean and Pacific, including Hawaii, know, after the abolition of slavery, people from the Indian subcontinent, China, the Middle East would all replace slaves in the plantation system. And before I continue, I would like to show you a little video that gives you a sense of the extent of the commerce in human beings. So this is a time lapse of the slave trade. Down here is a sort of bar that shows where people went. This is mainland America. This is the Caribbean. This is Brazil. And this gives you basically the slave trade as represented by all the boats that left Africa and went to the Americas. So one of the things that always surprises me about the video is just when you think it's going to stop, it seems to sort of accelerate and explode. That's only one of the things that surprised me about the video. So from the 17th century onwards, the transatlantic slave trade was one of the key engines facilitating agricultural production, production of infrastructure, and the settlement and viability of overseas colonies. The Portuguese and Dutch dominate the early slave trade until the 1700s. However, by the 18th century, Britain emerges as the largest slave trading nation. We all know that the trade transported African captives from the forts in Africa to locations in the Americas. 20% of all captives did not survive the passage, and 1/3 of the captives that did survive the crossing would not survive the first 3 years on the New World plantations. In Africa, the trade in human beings destabilized nations. It created a new status quo where war became one of the primary mechanisms for the acquisition of wealth and power. Nations, kings, and local leaders would fight each other to generate captives for trade with Europeans. We know that up to 20 million people were taken from their homes and transported to a hostile and dangerous world. We also know that the lives of those who were not taken and the communities that they were stolen from were irrecoverably changed. Messed that word up. However, the effect was just not on the bodies and lives of Africans transported across the Atlantic. The effect of the slave trade on Europe was extensive. It strengthened key ports, think Liverpool and Nice and Marseille. Likewise, the slave trade and products of plantation slavery were integral parts of European commercial and social life. It created new infrastructures of trade, including innovations in finance and insurance. How does one insure and finance goods where one does not even know how many will arrive? Right? It also produced capital and human beings, circulating the products of their labor, and made possible other products that resulted from their labor. Right? However, by the end of the 18th century, the status quo was under attack. In the last quarter of the century, abolition of the slave trade as a political and social movement emerged. As scholars of abolition have noted, the slave trade and plantation slavery became an international issue during the American Revolution. Here, one can think of the removed passage in the Declaration of Independence that accuses King George of, quote, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, end quote. That was taken out, and the other ones that we are more familiar with remained. In contrast, supporters of the British argued that the American colonists could not be trusted to rule themselves due to their own ongoing commitment to plantation slavery, a system that showed a complete disregard for human life. So one of the things that emerges is that people recognize that slavery is a complete disregard for human life and that this becomes a political issue. The British saw the Americans as holding confused ideas of liberty and freedom due to the hypocrisy of claiming natural rights while denying it to enslaved people. During the American crisis, slavery was brought to the forefront of national and international politics, and 8 anti-slavery positions were seen as virtuous. And I gave you a long quote, which I will not read to you. But I do want to say that, as you see in the quote behind me, historian Christopher L. Brown argues that slavery came to be seen as a product of human choice rather than a natural institution beyond the human will. And if slavery is a product of human choice, then people can choose differently. With slavery seen in this way, individuals and groups could be held morally culpable, responsible for supporting or not opposing slavery, right? The American Revolution is the first time that opposition to slavery became a virtue, a political virtue. That by being opposed to slavery, one is seen as virtuous, as a political person, and as a human being. Before that, that was not true. Right? In the aftermath of the revolution, American independence produced even greater sentiments in Britain. The traumatic loss of their most productive colonies led British politicians and the British public to look for ways to redeem the political and moral calamity of the dissolution of its empire. So we never think about how Britain responded to the loss of their most productive colonies. And one of the ways that they responded was thinking, how do we get to this point? How can we be different? What can we do to change our status in the world stage? So I've talked a bit about the slave trade and abolitionism, but I want to say a little something about slavery itself, right? I want to say that chattel slavery is the absence of any political rights and social standing. John Locke famously argued that enslaved people, quote, being in the state of slavery, not capable of any property, cannot in that state be considered as any part of civil society. So enslaved people are outside of society. Chattel slavery places the enslaved outside of politics. Enslaved people had no political rights, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of press, freedom of religion and conscience. None of these constitutional protections applied. The United States Bill of Rights does not apply or did not apply to enslaved populations, but only to those who were citizens of states. And since slaves were not citizens of states, they were also not citizens of the United States. To be a slave is not to be a citizen, but rather to be the property of a citizen who is protected by law and has guaranteed rights. In fact, enslaved people had no standing before the law. They could not serve on juries. They could not even give testimony. They could not sue. They could not obviously hold office. And they were only related to the law through criminal law and property law. All right. So I think this goes to the heart of our understanding of civil society. In modern Europe and America, society is seen as a domain of those who are free and citizens. And the things that characterize that civil society, the things that characterize our choices in civil society, were all denied to enslaved populations and individuals. They had no control over their marriages, their children, their education, and no control over their bodies as we think of it in terms of freedom of movement. They lacked any legal right to their bodies, their labor, and even their existence. The murder of a slave was rarely illegal, and where it was, the prosecution of murder was virtually impossible. Who was going to prosecute a citizen for killing his property? In many ways, chattel slavery attempted to render enslaved men and women into the inverse of free men and women. And it's at this point that I want to talk about the Black radical tradition, because the Black radical tradition emerges from this context of widespread unfreedom produced by the slave trade and slavery. In the 18th century, we have the emergence of formerly enslaved people of African descent producing their own narratives, their own philosophical treatises, their own letters, their own poems, their own public proclamations, and much more. The archive of Black thought in the 18th century is richer than in previous centuries because we have the literary documents of poems such as Phyllis Wheatley and the slave narratives of writers such as Olaudah Equiano and Ottobah Cugoano. Likewise, we have the documented thoughts of political readers such as Toussaint Louverture, Jacques Dessalines, Henry Christophe, key figures in the Haitian Revolution. So I just want to note that before the 18th century, you did not have this flurry of authored ideas about Blackness and enslavement, about what it meant to be Black in the world, you did not have this. And in the 18th century, you see the explosion in not only literature, but also politics. And that is just at the moment that you have this explosion in radical thought in Europe, you have this explosion of philosophical and political thought and literary thought throughout the Americas. So I want to spend some time thinking about Ottobah Cugoano. This is the book that he wrote, one of the creators of the slave narrative genre. In particular, I wanted to spend some time thinking about his criticism of colonialism, the slave trade, and plantation slavery. Let me get a drink of water very quickly. Take a deep breath. Cugoano was an Afro-British abolitionist who at the age of 13 was kidnapped from Ghana, was enslaved in Grenada, gained his freedom, and eventually settled in England. What we know about Cugoano is limited to his two published versions of his treatise Thoughts and Sentiments on the Evil of Slavery, published in 1787 and 1791, and the letters that he sent to leading European figures. We don't know when and how he died or where he is buried. That's all we know. We have these two books and about 50 letters that he sent to leading figures like Burke and Wilberforce and so on and so forth. Cugoano had a radical vision that combined his thoughts on the slave trade with his thoughts on European colonialism and the status of black life in a global context. He traces the development of both slavery and colonialism to the same event in European history, the conquest of the Americas during the 15th and 16th century. For Cugoano, the nature of modern colonialism and slavery is visible in Spanish conquest and enslavement of indigenous people before the 18th century. He writes, "The Spaniards begin their settlements in the West Indies and America by depredations of rapine, injustice, treachery, and murder, and they have continued in the barbarous practice of devastation, cruelty, and oppression ever since. And their principles and maxims in planting colonies have been adopted in some measure by every other nation in Europe." So for Cugoano, the brutality of Spanish conquest is represented by retelling the histories of the conquest of Hispaniola, Mexico, and Peru. It is the histories of the conquistadors that he finds as the best lens for understanding colonialism and slavery. So one thinks about Cortez, and one thinks about Pizarro, and one thinks about the sort of destructive capacity and the histories of this, what we consider Spanish conquistadors. This is what Cugoano thinks is the beginning not only of colonialism and slavery, but also the beginning of a particular type of destruction of black and indigenous bodies. So for him, the violence of Spanish actions and policies were not aberrations in history and the practice of modern colonialism, but rather its essential labor. It's essential, there we go. Aimé Césaire takes up this point in his discourse on colonialism when he writes that colonialism is not about religion or moral progress or freedom or any other purported ideal, but rather is about appetite and force. And you can see the marvelous quote on the screen. And what Césaire is talking about is how all the sort of reasons why people give for conquering another people are just illusions and hypocritical ways of thinking about appetite and force. That you conquer other people because you want wealth and prestige and power. So for Cugoano, the Spanish mode of violent conquest and enslavement became the standard form of European colonization adopted by other European nations. In this way, indigenous land dispossession, indigenous slavery, African slavery, and the cruelties and devastation of modern European colonialism in India were all part of the same historical process begin when the Spanish first encountered indigenous people, right? And the continuation of the slave trade and slavery shows the connection between the 15th and the 16th century and the 18th century. Cugoano was not only focused on what happened to Africans in the Atlantic, but also what happened to people throughout the globe. And so he spent some time really thinking through the British conquest of India in 1757, right? He writes, to destroy 11 million and distress many more in America, to starve and oppress 12 million in Asia, and the great number destroyed, is not the way to promote the dignity, strength, and safety of empire. While claiming that this destruction undermines empire, he further argued that the devastations abroad would also lead to calamity in Europe. And this is a common refrain in anti-slavery and anti-colonial thought, which is that the violence that is done elsewhere comes back and haunts the people in the nations that are doing that violence, right? So Cugoano expressly believed that the spoils of India would spell political ruin for Britain. According to him, the exploitation of India produced a dangerous set of men able to transform their colonial wealth into metropolitan power and prestige, right? It says, the plunderers abroad send home their cash as fast as they can, and by one means and another, the sums wanted to borrow are soon made up. At last, when the war subside and other business calls them home, laden with the spoils of the East or elsewhere, they have then the grand part of their business to negotiate in buying up bank stocks and lodging their plunder and ill-gotten wealth in the British or other funds. So he's talking about the transfer of funds from colonial contexts to sort of metropolitan contexts and how that leads to particular problems within Europe, right? So those people who are doing the most harm abroad are able to not only bring their money, but then become the leading people within the nation. And for Cugoano, as well as Edmund Burke, this is a problem. It is the world turned upside down. Those people who deny liberty abroad and kill and steal abroad then become those people who are able to govern the nation that one cares about. So Cugoano was a radical proponent of the abolition of slavery and the slave trade. And at the center of Cugoano's call for abolition was a recognition of the rights and humanity of Africans. As Anthony Bogues argued in Black Heretics, Black Prophets, European thinkers struggled with conceptualizing Africans as fully human. So Bogue writes, there was a Rubicon that neither Paine nor Diderot seemed to be able to cross. And he's thinking about the most radical Enlightenment thinkers. The granting of full human status to Africans. In the end, many radical Enlightenment thinkers foundered on this point. The critical issue was that underneath the surface of modern political thought of this period lay a definition of the human that excluded African slaves. However, Otobo Cugoano does affirm African humanity on two distinct levels. He conceptualizes Africans as bearers of natural rights and represents them as fully rational, emotional, and sympathetic beings. So for Cugoano, slavery obviously contradicted, quote, the common rights and liberties of men, end quote, by treating them as property, right? Likewise, in his defense of Africans, he evokes the aspects of African life that his British audience would most readily identify with, right? This includes, but is not limited to, attachment to one's nation, love of freedom, property ownership, and love of one's family. So what Cugoano does in his book is really show the connections between British and African life in order to say, these people are really not so different from you. Actually, in the most important ways, they are exactly the same. And that is something that he feels the radical and the thinkers of that time were not doing, right? So he's got this beautiful, beautiful quote about the sort of emotional attachment that people have for their children and that they have for their freedoms, that they have for everything that their sons and daughters, and how this is the same as those who have a predilection for their own country, freedom and liberty, as the sons and daughters of fair Britain. So he's saying Africans are as committed to liberty and property and community and their children and their wives as British people. For Kugwano, not only are Africans attached to their family and friends, something slave traders denied, but they're also attached to their liberty in a way that the British could understand. He argues that Africans are as sensitive and emotionally developed and rational as their European counterparts. They feel anguish not only at the loss of their loved ones, but also at the loss of freedoms and the benefits of civil life. So Kugwano's understanding of Africans as fully human has profound implications for his recommendations for the slave trade and plantation slavery. He argues that slavery must be abolished when he writes, "I would propose that a total abolition of slavery should be made and proclaimed, and that an universal emancipation of slaves should begin from the date thereof." And part of what he's getting at is that at the time in which he's writing, people, so many slides, so little time. Part of what he's getting at is the understanding that people, at the time in which the abolition emerges, there's a way in which Europe and European political thinkers and actors are saying, we're going to do this later. We're going to do this in 20 years. We'll do this in 5 generations. For him, that just conflicts with the understanding of Africans as human beings who have rights and liberties and fully human beings that should be immediately sort of emancipated. So he says, and I'm going to just cut this short, but why should total abolition and a universal emancipation of slaves be feared at all? Right? For a person who believes that captive Africans are fully human beings who have been unjustly kidnapped, like him, universal emancipation represents a return of natural and civil liberty. Immediate or rapid emancipation represents the only logical outcome to the problem of slavery when one accepts the humanity of Africans in their possession of natural rights. And that is what makes Kugwano the most radical abolitionist of the 18th century, except for those who are participating in the Haitian Revolution. Right? So we have a really great example of Kugwano's global analysis and also the Black radical thought in the 18th century, the insistence that slavery and the slave trade have created a set of conditions that make it dangerous for Black people throughout the world. Right? According to Kugwano, colonialism and chattel slavery has diminished the value of Black bodies in the eyes of Europeans. When he's writing about the Zong massacre, in which 133 enslaved Africans were thrown overboard for insurance purposes, right? Thrown overboard, live people who were thrown overboard in order to collect insurance. He writes, "But our lives are accounted of no value. We are hunted after as the prey in the desert, and doomed to destruction as the beasts that perish. For this, should we appear to the inhabitants of Europe, would they dare to say that they have not wronged us and grievously injured us, and that the blood of millions do not cry out against them?" He articulates an insight that echoes throughout the Black radical tradition. And this is the idea that the lack of a value attached to Black life, and how this is traceable not only to existing institutions and practices, slavery and the slave trade, but also to ideas that emerge from these violent institutions of unfreedom. So thinkers will take this analysis and apply it to not only slavery, but lynching and capitalism, colonialism, and police brutality, amongst many other things. I have just a little bit of time to talk about the Haitian Revolution, I think. So the Haitian Revolution is sort of very, very important in Black radical thought. It's the last of the three great revolutions of the 18th century. It follows both the American Revolution and the French Revolution. As you know, the French sided with the American colonies in order to embarrass and weaken the British during the American Revolution. But this ultimately sort of created so many problems in France. It bankrupted the crown, and the French Revolution would follow the sort of economic and political policies that were created by France being involved in the American Revolution. And I love this picture. It's it's the women of Paris taking the king and queen from Versailles and taking them to Paris. So the Haitian Revolution occurs 2 years after the French Revolution, and it's the result of two sort of often antagonistic and distinct populations and how they come to unite against colonialism and slavery, right? So in Haiti, you had free black men and women who were looking for civil rights, and they joined with rebelling slaves who were attempting to flee and dismantle the plantation system, right? I can't tell you the history of that, the whole history, because that is a whole lecture in itself. But they do become united, and what they do when they become united is very important. So Haiti emerges as the first black republic in the modern world. It was a second nation, independent nation in the Americas. It was the second nation to abolish slavery, right? It is, for many, many people, the sort of full instantiation of what does it mean for people to actually be equal and free based on the idea of natural rights, right? If up to that point, what it meant to be free and equal was only limited to those people who were property owners and were white. The Haitian Revolution says people who are black and who are formerly enslaved can be citizens of a nation, right? I want to say just a little bit about what the Haitian Revolution sort of accomplished and what it does for black sort of political thought. This here is Toussaint Louverture, and this is Jacques Dessalines. And these are two of the great generals and two of the first leaders of Haiti. Toussaint died in a prison in France, and Dessalines was able to bring Haitian independence to its sort of conclusion in 1804. Right. One thing that the Haitian Revolution sort of gives us is a sort of sight to understand something that people consider marronage, and that is communities that were a thorn in the side of colonial administrators, communities of runaway slaves who constituted themselves as free and independent over and against the plantation system and European society. Right? So I get this from Black Marxism, but one of the things that we see in the Haitian Revolution is this active resistance to slavery, right? And for Cedric Robinson, immediately when slave populations are brought to the Americas, they seek freedom, right? So at first, as a rule, resistance among the slaves took the form of a flight to native or indigenous settlements. And then this flight to indigenous settlements would over time become settlements of black people who armed themselves to prevent them from being sort of taken back into slavery. And for many thinkers, marronage happens simultaneously with the enslavement of black people. So at the moment in which people are being enslaved, people are desiring freedom. People are fighting for their freedom. People are willing to risk their lives. People are willing to sort of defend their freedom. And that's the history of marronage and the history and how it sort of begins to connect with slavery. I want to say something about the Haitian sort of Declaration of Independence, which is one of the more radical. We think about the American Declaration of Independence as the most radical text, American Declaration of Independence, or the rights of man as the thing that really sort of shows human beings desiring freedom. But the Haitian Declaration of Independence also does that, right? The Haitian Declaration of Independence, authored by Jacques Dessalines, is radical in two distinct and interconnected ways. First, it forever rejects chattel slavery. And second, it severs Haiti from its colonial ties. It is clear that the first, abolition, is the reason for the second, severance of colonial ties. Thus, the Declaration states, "We must, with one last act of national authority, forever ensure liberty's reign in the country of our birth. We must take any hope of re-enslaving us away from the inhumane government that for so long kept us in the most humiliating stagnation." This should sound very familiar. In the end, we must live independent or die, right? This is very different and the same as Patrick Henry's sort of declaration. It's different because it's spoken by somebody who was enslaved and who has climbed out of slavery through a particular forceful will, and that makes all the difference in the world. For Dessalines, independence is the final display to France and other European nations that the population of Haiti, which included a superabundance of formerly enslaved people, will remain free of chattel slavery forever. Right? The declaration is a decisive act and statement meant to put an end once and for all to the question of whether Haiti will be a site of slavery or whether it will be a site free of chattel slavery. It is in line with and embodies the most radical Black abolitionism, while it also connects this abolitionism to anti-colonialism. I want to say that you might know this, but that the reason why Haitians declared their independence was Napoleon introduced slavery into all the French Caribbean colonies in 1803. So Napoleon is coming and looking to conquer Haiti and take those people who had freed themselves and put them back into slavery, right? So, this is a more. So Dessalines and others and the Haitian people are not for this. And he has a proclamation called Liberty or Death Proclamation, literally. And it serves as an extension of the Haitian Declaration of Independence. And it also serves as a defense of the expulsion and killing of white male French citizens. For Dessalines, Napoleon's 1803 reintroduction of slavery through the French Caribbean provides both the need and rationale for killing and expelling any French white male former slave owner. It's important that all of those things are there, right? They're not killing the English, they're not killing the Americans, they're killing French white male slave owners, and for the most part. And he writes, yes, we have rendered to these true cannibals war for war, crime for crime, outrage for outrage. Yes, I have saved my country. I have avenged America. The avowal I make of it in the face of earth and heaven constitutes my pride and my glory. Right? In many ways, Dessalines' claim to avenge America is positioned in the recent events of the wrongs against Black people throughout the French colonies, but it also harkens to the larger wrongs done to Black and indigenous people since the discovery of the New World. Right? Dessalines recognizes the history of indigenous people in the Caribbean and on Saint-Domingue when he renames the island Haiti based on the Arawak word. To have claimed to avenge America is so grand and profound because the America that he imagines is not the Americas of the European colonists and their descendants, but rather indigenous and African people throughout. I interpret him as taking responsibility for righting some great wrong, a reparation of some kind. It is clear that Dessalines does not mean to suggest that this vengeance is commiserate with the historical destruction that European colonialism has wrought, nor does it erase the bondage of African people throughout the Caribbean and the continued subjugation of indigenous people. He's not saying now America is free, now everything is okay. He's saying something very particular. He is setting right of a wrong. He is putting something into its proper alignment. Those who were enslaved are no longer enslaved in Haiti. Those who are denied civil rights now have them. Those who are placed at the bottom of a logic of racial hierarchy are now independent. European colonial powers have been beaten back, France, Spain, Britain, and this constitutes a form of vengeance. It is this idea that the destruction of racial hierarchies and the placement of political and social power into the hands of formerly colonized and enslaved people is this idea that has been taken seriously by Black radical intellectuals and thinkers. Oh, I have all of 5 minutes. I'm going to use them. I'm going to use them. So I would like to mention the role of women in inaugurating and sustaining the Haitian Revolution, as Joan Dayan explains. In most standard histories, especially those written by foreigners, the women who fought with the Black rebels and even took part in the ceremony of Bos Caiman are not mentioned, end quote. Enslaved and free women were leaders and representatives of communities, were part of the networks of conspirators, were fighters in combat, spies, and workers who fed and built infrastructure supporting the revolution. As one historian put it, the rebel army, by contrast, incorporated many women of color, concluding that their own freedom was at stake in this momentous conflict. They took over tasks that were essential to the ultimate victory, such as growing provisions, spying on the French, and even fighting. Leaving aside the derogatory nature of the even fighting, women were essential and at the forefront of revolutionary politics. And this is something that I continue to develop in my manuscript. Let me conclude, and then we'll have a very long and hopefully great conversation. Ruth Gilmore writes that the Black radical tradition is one that relies on understood kinship. And we can think about understood kinship in terms of how the women of the Haitian Revolution are practitioners of contemporary and past Maroon traditions. Alicia Garza, one of the founders of the hashtag Black Lives Matter movement, has been very clear that Black feminist writers and activists from the 1970s and 1980s served as a key inspiration for her when she co-founded the hashtag Black Lives Matter movement. So we have to think about a tradition as something in which you can choose your ancestors. And you're open to say, these people are giving me the intellectual capacity and the spiritual capacity and the practical capacity to do this particular type of radical work. It's a very different understanding of tradition than what we have when we think about the European canon or things that are handed down. Here you get to choose. And Alicia Garza, when she's creating Black Lives Matter and co-founding it, is thinking, I'm drawing upon the Black feminists such as Audre Lorde and Toni Cade Bambara and all these people in order to create a movement that is attempting to deal with this contemporary problem. And this is what Ruth Gilmore, I imagine, is thinking about when she's thinking about the living thought, and she's thinking about the sort of capacity of the Black radical tradition to have so many different tools at one's disposal if one is able to take it and recognize that this is my ancestor, this is my kin, and I can take that and use it. So I believe that such movement as the hashtag Black Lives Matters, prison abolitionism, anti-gentrification, and educational equality all show the power of Black women to lead and organize alongside others. I think that before the power of women was made increasingly apparent in electoral politics in 2018, an election that sent more women to Congress than ever before, it was visible and hope for apparent and grassroots politics not practiced through the state. So one 18th century lesson for today is not to lose the sight of women as both theoretical and political leaders in key struggles for justice, freedom, equality, and sovereignty. Right? It's the Haitian Revolution and the women who participated in it, and it's also Alicia Garza and her co-founders in creating the most profound political, social movement of the last 50 years. I also think that Cuguano's analysis of slavery and the slave trade should force us to think globally about local ills. Our political and social contexts require global analyses and global histories that would make Cuguano proud, right? If the world was complicated and interconnected during the 18th century, how much more complex and interconnected is it now, right? I think in a different vein, Dessalines' declaration to have avenged America and the Haitian Revolution show how important the accomplishment of local destruction of inequality and subsequent founding of freedom can be, right? Acting to right the wrongs that are within your power, within your city, your state, and your nation or university does not erase the harm done elsewhere or in the past, but it also isn't a trifle, right? Finally, of equal importance is the recognition that the devaluation of Black lives has a long history. And hopefully, if there's a takeaway, is that this history is centuries long. The racial structure of the 18th century that allows for Cuguano to state explicitly that, quote, our lives are accounted of no value, end quote, is connected to the devaluation of Black lives today. So I think the promise of Black radical political thought can help us understand, complicate, and unravel these histories. And I contend that the 18th century has important lessons for the 21st. I'll stop right there and get some water.
Okay, we'll take your questions, and we ask our speaker to please repeat the questions.
I will.
Did Toussaint Louverture leave any writings behind also?
Yes, a lot of what we have are.
Repeat the question.
Oh, haha. Did Toussaint Louverture leave writings? Yes. Lots of letters, lots of things that were sent out to the public. This is what I was talking about in terms of the 18th century having actual writings and things that we can look at that show Black people's commitment to their own freedom into a more just world. So yeah, Toussaint
Can
left
you
a bunch of.
questions.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Oh, did I repeat the question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Sorry.
So this is what I mean when I'm talking about the 18th century being this flourishing of Black writing in which people are able to author themselves what the Black experience is politically and socially and existentially within this larger context. Yeah. Yes.
I'm curious, given the content of Cuguano's book, how did it get published and how did it get saved? Why do we have it?
Okay, so given the content of Cuguano's book, how did it get published and how is it saved and why do we have it for today? Those are great questions. One thing that the abolitionist movement did was create pamphlets and create subscriptions to pamphlets in which you sort of put down your money and they send you the best abolitionist writing of the day. They send you the newest book on why you should abolish slavery. And part of the thing was, if you contribute to this, then you'll be getting knowledge, but you'll also be contributing to sort of authors who are then able to go about and do things in order to create the abolition of slavery. And so in that sense, it was sent to so many different people. It's in archives in Britain and elsewhere because prominent people have them and save them, and then it's part of their archive. And they went to libraries and so on and so forth in a long in the long sense. But Cuguano's text is not as popular, and nor was it as financially, it wasn't as financially beneficial to him as Equiano's narrative. So we know that Equiano's narrative went through 7 printings and so on and so forth. And Cuguano is a much more obscure figure in relationship to his countrymen who he knew and his friend and the person who he was actually engaged with and who many think he helped write this other narrative. He's a more obscure figure.
Questions?
Can you speak to how the use of minority, the concept of minority currently keeps going some of what you're talking about?
So can I speak to how minority and the concept of minority sort of connects with the things that I'm talking about here? I think that Cuguano and others would say that we have to recognize that there are hierarchies, racial and otherwise, that are functioning within our society. And one of the ways in which we label that is minorities, and that that's part of a longer history. Some people like to say minoritized, which is, you are made into a minority, or some people like to think about what does it mean to be positioned in a state that is unfree and unequal. And I think we can see from the 18th century that some of those structures are still alive and well today and functioning in different ways, but not so different that a quote from an 18th century thinker does not sort of appear to us as something that could be said today. Right? So things are different, but they're not so different that Cuguano can say black life has no value and us say, well, what is he talking about? Why would anybody think that in that way? Yeah.
Question?
Like in Central America, Honduras, and there was I couldn't tell from your little thing that they were actually making it all the way to Honduras, the boats and that kind of thing. But I mean, obviously they don't have slaves there now. But was there an actual revolution, a declaration that they were doing away with slavery there, or did it just kind of empty out?
So thinking about Honduras and sort of the fact that we can see slave ships going to different parts of Latin America and the Caribbean, your question is, what happened to all of the people who were there, and did they get free, or are they free in some sort of way? I think the answer to that question is profoundly complex. One thing that I would say about that is that the devaluation of black life that we might find in the United States is not something that only exists in the United States, because the slave system and slavery was something that happened all throughout the Americas. And black people who are currently in America, whether it be in Brazil or Colombia or the United States or Mexico, are still put in a position of inferiority due to their blackness. And each country is very different. Brazil is not the same as the United States. The United States is not the same as Colombia. These are different histories. What is pretty prominent throughout all of them is that the history of slavery and the slave trade has not produced freedom for these people who are descendants of slaves. So throughout the Americas, the descendants of slaves are still in some ways, whether it's through colonialism or whether it's through prejudice or lack of access to basic political and social rights, are still in some ways profoundly unfree. And that means that the abolition of slavery and the destruction of colonialism did not produce the freedom that we imagine, which is why you can have something like the Emancipation Proclamation, and then 30 years later, you can have something called Jim Crow. Right? The abolition of slavery is not the freedom of black people, nor is it the creation of a society in which people are free and equal. And I think that's one way of cutting what you're saying.
Question?
You're
then back, yeah. Mhm. Yes.
Dr. Peters,
Yes.
when I first, well, my question is this. When I first started hearing the movement of hashtag all Black Lives Matter, and there was a pushback, well, all lives should matter, and of course, I felt that way very strongly, but now, what do you envision going forward? Is the Black Lives Matter going to develop based on your historical perspective? Where are we going to see Black Lives Matter in 15 years, let's say?
Oh, that's a good question. So where do we see the hashtag Black Lives Matters movement in 15 or 20 and 30 years? That is not a question I can answer in the sense of I can't tell the future. What I can say is that the hashtag Black Lives Matter movement, which started with a real focus on contending and dealing with police brutality, also imagined itself as a site for thinking about other things and inequalities and injustices that exist in the United States. And so one way of taking this up is that on one hand, even before the hashtag Black Lives Matter movement, people were agitating for greater equality in education, greater job access, better housing, better, more access to basic social goods. And what the hashtag Black Lives Matter movement did, and then all the different organizations that were contesting against police brutality was bring that to the forefront of our consciousness. In one way, what I would say is that what we are going to continually see are people attempting to be free and equal and liberated within this context, as long as they are unfree and without certain things. And I think that is the biggest point made by sort of Marunaj, which is at the moment in which you have enslaved people who are enslaved, you have people who are sort of pushing back against that unfreedom. And at the moment, I think, which we continually have Black people, but not only Black people being unfree, we are going to see social upheaval and political sort of movements and social movements that are attempting to redress that. That is the nature of human freedom. It is historically accurate to think that. And I think until we are able to create more just and equitable societies, that is going to continue. What that's going to look like in 20 years, I don't quite know. I hope that we live in a better and just and more equitable world 20 years from now than we do now, although I believe that we have to work towards that world. It just will not happen.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Do you see the political instability in Africa today related back to all of the transportation of the slaves back in the 1800s?
So the question is the political instability of Africa today the result of the transportation of enslaved people in the 16th, 17th, 18th century? 18th and 19th century. I think yes and no. And the yes part of it is that what the slave trade did was create a destructive relationship between Africa and Europe that was premised on sort of the capture and transportation of Africans. The no part of it is that in the 19th and the 20th century, European countries explicitly begin to conquer and to take over and control territorially Africa. And that is more of a closer and different relationship to now than before. So if we're thinking about the Algeria and Congo and South Africa and so on, we have to think that the instability of Africa is the result of explicit European colonization and imperialism in the in the 19th and the 20th century. And if we want to understand if we want to understand Africa today, we have to look to those historical periods in order to understand in order to understand the present. That's everybody has to go just read a lot more, unfortunately, that's my answer to everything. Read and do a lot more. Yeah, so wonderful questions. Yes.
Yes, in hashtag Black Lives Matter, my goal would be that all lives matter.
Yes.
And that we would get there, and we're not there now,
Yes.
but that we would eventually get there.
Yes. 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 So the statement is, in the hashtag Black Lives Matter, the impetus is how does that fit with all lives mattering, right? How does Black Lives Matter fit with all lives mattering? I think part of what's happening in the phrase Black Lives Matter and the sort of is that there's Black lives should matter. In contemporary times, Black lives do not matter. All lives should matter, but at this particular time, they do not matter. And what we need to do is get from should to actually do. And I think the Black radical tradition is very good at that, which is when Cuguano is talking about enslaved people have natural rights and natural liberties, he's not saying only enslaved people should have natural rights and natural liberties. Only Black lives should matter. He's saying they are in a position in which that is not true, and what the abolition of slavery should accomplish is actually this larger understanding that all human beings are equal and free and deserving of respect. And it's that sort of tension that that we can see in the Black radical tradition, but also in feminist sort of political theory and action. Like women should, in some ways, be accorded the same type of freedoms and equality and ability to function in society as their male counterparts. They are not. And that doesn't mean that a focus on women means that that people do not take seriously some understanding of equality. It's rather by focusing on inequality and what is not happening, one is able to move from that place to a much better and more just and equitable world. And that's my sort of understanding of that.
Question?
It occurs to me, though, sort of the counter to the all lives matter issue is that can be used to water down the issue of Black Lives Matter. And I think, if you look at Orwell's statement, all the animals in the barn are equal, but some animals are more equal. I think we need to really deal with Black Lives Matter as much as.
Okay, so the statement was that all lives matter appears as a watering down of the protest and the reality of Black Lives Matter, and that we should be attentive to Black Lives Matter as something in itself and take it seriously. I think that's right. I think that is spot on. That when people make ethical claims on us, we should really think about the claims that they are making in a very generous and honest way, and not misconstrue that or not attempt to elide that. And there's a reason why we attempt to elide claims, because those claims are difficult. They require a change in behavior. They require certain sacrifices. They require that we don't do the things the same way, right? Being ethical is not practical. Being ethical is not great for your career, right? Being ethical is not going to fill up your bank account per se, right? When people make claims on us, ethical claims, they are making a demand that we change our lives in order to afford them what they would like in human value. and that can be a very difficult thing. I made some very big claims in those statements right there, but I think that we can sort of think them through.
Yes.
In the video where the illustrated the slave traffic,
Yeah.
at one point you indicated it was slowing down and you were surprised when it speeded up again. You said that was one of many other surprises.
Yeah.
Could you speak to those other surprises?
The other thing that, let me repeat the question. So in the video, when I said, when it's in the video of the slave trade where it seems to be slowing down, and I said I'm always surprised that it sort of explodes afterwards, and it always catches me off guard. What are the other surprises that I see in that video? I would say one of the great surprises is thinking about how much slavery does not have to do with the United States and the 13 colonies. That when you're watching the video, you are watching slavery that enslaved people going to places that we don't necessarily even think about as having black people or don't necessarily think about as having the most black people, right? Brazil has the most black people outside of Africa. It is a country in which the majority of the 320 million, I might be wrong on that number, are self-identified black people, descendants of slaves, and identify themselves as black. So one of the surprises that always captures my imagination is how we always think of blackness in terms of the United States and never in terms of Latin America and the Caribbean. And I think another thing, a sort of corollary of that is, and one thing that I always try to push is that slavery is not, the picture of slavery that we should have is not of cotton, right? Slavery is about sugar. Slavery is about rice. Slavery is about tobacco. Slavery is about anything that in the Americas in which enslaved laborers sort of produced. So this understanding of slavery as about cotton is just the understanding that we have because of the cotton boom of the sort of beginning of the 19th century to the 1865. And it's not the reality of what enslaved people were doing throughout the Americas. That's one of the things that always pops out to me.
We have in the back.
I agree with everything you've said, but I keep hearing the word should, could, can. What specific acts within our society, what specific educational programs, what specific fill in the blank could this society do to make sure that we are on the right road, that everyone, Black lives matter, white lives, Indian lives matter, American Native lives matter. What specific acts, what specific goals could we reach or have to in order that we reach that goal?
Okay, that is the question. So let me restate that. What specific things can we do in order to ensure that black lives do matter and that sort of indigenous lives do matter and that people are living in a free and equal and in ethical relations to each other? I'm not sure I have those type of answers. What I would say is that what I think the Black radical tradition and our history of radical thought and our history of social and political movements sort of show is that demands for freedom and equality and have to be taken seriously. Why in Michigan and throughout the United States is there such a profound inequality in education, right? There are reasons why having education being tied to locales and to the tax base of a particular place rather than a sort of equal sort of education for all, in which everybody's getting the same money, right? And everybody's getting the same. I'm not a politician, and I'm definitely not somebody who spends a lot of time thinking about the nuts and bolts of politics per se. I would say that we know that children are really, really going to bed hungry. We know that people are stuck in positions of not having access to health and health care and education and so on. And it's up to us to make sure that those things change. What that looks like might look differently for everybody in this room and differently from everybody out there in the larger world. But I think that the demand is that those things do change, and also that we might actually have the knowledge and the power together to make those changes. But it also means that we actually have to go about attempting to change those things. And I'm not sure, if you think about child hunger, I'm not sure that there is enough sufficient political or ethical will to actually deal with the fact that so many children in Michigan go hungry. We know that's a bad thing. We know it should not happen, and yet it continually happens. And I think that's part of what Cuguano is saying. We know slavery is a bad thing. You know, here's why it's happening, but yet it continues to happen. That's a terrible answer to that question.
There doesn't seem to be any reference to Jean-Jacques Rousseau's idea of the natural rights of man. Is that where all of this idea comes from, or is his idea just mentioned in passing?
Okay, that's a very good question. So there's no references to Jean-Jacques Rousseau's natural rights, and how does Cuguano and possibly the Haitian Revolution take up or not take up those ideas? I think one way to imagine what is happening, I think you can see this in the sort of Dessalines Declaration. They are aware that of what natural rights means and what it's supposed to mean. They are aware that some people have access to political and social power, and they are thinking alongside of and also against the ideas of natural rights as it was understood at that time, right? So there's two separate things. Enslaved people want their freedom and want to be part of communities that they can control and so on and so forth. And that doesn't require a theory, right? That's the point, which is like Marunage and people escaping slavery does not require that you read the Declaration of Independence, does not require that you read Marx. You don't have to read Marx to want a better wage, right? So there's that. So this slavery is a state of unfreedom of which enslaved people are attempting to overcome. And then the way that they articulate what that unfreedom looks like and why it's important to overcome that is in the language of natural rights, is in the language of the European understanding of rights and liberty and equality, and is a challenge to the understanding that does not see them as bearers of those rights. And for Toussaint, obviously, he read widely. Cuguano is reading the Bible. He's reading abolitionist texts. He's reading all things coming out of England. They're aware of these claims to liberty and even the history and the books behind them. But they're also utilizing them in a way that that is very different. I think that's a very good question.
The only question I have is this, I'm assuming you teach this subject.
Yes.
Are the students passionate about it?
Okay, so the question is, are the students passionate about the subject that I teach? Yes. And the students, I think, the students are passionate about the things that I think they find a lot of value in reading these texts because these texts seem to mirror so closely the world that they live in. I think their students are always looking to fill in knowledge and are really attracted to thinking about freedom and rights and race and gender and how does one build a better society. I think many, if not all of us, are really interested in those things. And as a teacher, my job is trying to create, to get them the right texts to sort of engage them in a way that is going to continue their sort of natural curiosity and passion for learning, and do it in a way that is that empowers them rather than leaves them feeling sort of disempowered. I do a lot less lecturing in my class. In my class, I like to have the students sort of talk amongst each other and present and really get at the work themselves so that when they leave the class at the end of the semester, they're able to talk about these things and convey them to their mother and their siblings and their best friends and feel that they can do these things. And that's sort of what I do in my teaching. But yeah, we have some wonderful students here, and I think Americans are concerned in general with freedom and so on, but not only Americans and not only American citizens. And I think people bring that to the classroom.
Any other questions? What would you say is your main message here today?
Oh, I think, what would I say is my main messages today? I have to repeat that. I think one of them is that the history of Black political thought and action is long. The history of what we consider racism and racial hierarchy and inequality is long. And these institutions that create unfreedom within our society are really sort of big and powerful and violent. On the other side of that, human beings have this great capacity to come together and produce radical change. And if we think about the 18th century, where the three revolutions came out of nowhere, right? Who thought that the American colonies were no longer going to be attached to Britain? Who thought that the people of France were going to destroy their monarchy and proclaim a republic? Who thought that enslaved Africans would rise up, destroy the plantation system, then create a nation? Nobody. And these are things that human beings did, right? And so although the things that the tasks that the challenges that face us are great and big and violent and who knows and much more, that doesn't mean that we do not have the capacity to radically change the world that we live in. And that would be one of the takeaways that I would say. And that I think that we should study the thinkers and many more who I mentioned, because I think the tools for how to change this sort of world in a much more just way has to do with addressing racism and taking it seriously, has to do with addressing colonialism and taking it seriously, has to do with addressing gender and taking it seriously, has to do with addressing inequality of wealth and taking it seriously, because I think that is, I think those, yeah, so I would say that is my takeaway.
On that note, we thank our speakers.
Thank you.
Very much. It may be available.